Well, welcome everybody. We are happy you're here for yet another wonderful series with Father Tom Bonacci. Father Tom, if you're not too familiar with him, is the co-founder of the Interfaith Peace Project and my expert on scripture and all things related to interfaith work. So I know that everybody always enjoys his sessions. So hopefully this morning you received, along with a reminder of the link, an updated set of handouts for the Gospel of Matthew. I did a whoopsie and told Father Tom Mark and then advertised Matthew. And he was graciously able to make a last minute switch for me. So I'm grateful for that. Although I think as I told him, I think he could talk about the weather and we would learn something. So no matter what, we know it's going to be a gift. So thank you all for being here and for being able to support the Interfaith Peace Project through attending. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Father Tom.
Welcome, Father Tom.
Welcome. Good to see you. Good to see you, Larry.
Just a reminder, we'll mute you or you can mute yourself so we don't hear any background noise, dogs barking, things like that in the background. But of course, you can press your space bar when it's time for questions or unmute.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay?
I hear you well.
Good. Thank you. Well, it's my blessing and privilege to be back with you again. Thank goodness for Zoom. We can cross the distance. This is going to be a 4-week series on the Gospel of Matthew. Now, of course, there's no way to cover the 28 chapters that comprise the Gospel of Matthew in 4 weeks. So what we'll do is highlight certain aspects of Matthew's Gospel that are relevant to this time in the church's life and to this time in the liturgical life of the church. As you know, this is the year A, and in the year A, we ordinarily read the Gospel of Matthew, except in the year A, on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Sunday, Matthew's Gospel is not typically read, but the Gospel of John is proclaimed on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Sundays of Lent, especially if there are people for baptism, confirmation, and First Communion. And so we might look at a little bit of that as the series unfolds. Also, Palm Sunday reads the Passion according to Matthew. Good Friday always reads the Passion according to John. So the 4-week series will go this way. Today, we'll look at the birth of Jesus in the Matthew's Gospel. Next week, the teachings of Jesus as they unfold in the 5 discourses, with special attention to discourse chapter 25. I was hungry and you gave me to eat, which is critical to Matthew's Gospel in general and unique to Matthew's Gospel. There's also the Gospel for the last Sunday of the year, the Feast of Christ the King. The 3rd week, we'll look at the supper in Matthew's Gospel, as well as some aspects of the Passion narrative. But in that 3rd week, we'll also pay attention to Pope Francis's letter on the liturgy. Last year, Pope Francis wrote a directive to the bishops, and this year wrote an apostolic letter to the general church. That apostolic letter on the liturgy is crucial to the further implementation of the Second Vatican Council. It is an exercise in spiritual excellence and liturgical excellence to read that letter. So we'll introduce that letter to you in the 3rd week if you're not already familiar with it. In the fourth week, we'll look at the resurrection account in Matthew's gospel. That figures typically Mary Magdalene, but Matthew has some points of view on Mary Magdalene that are unique to the gospel of Mary Magdalene. Also, as you know, the worldwide church is in the modality of synodality. By synod, you mean that ancient understanding of the church that we walk together. The word synod is an ancient Greek word. It is the word for the ecumenical councils. It's also the word for the gathering of the community. And whenever we're in this synodal mode, remember, it's from the synods of the ancient church that we derive the great doctrines of Trinity, incarnation, grace, and the creeds. What the Second Vatican Council did is what Francis is now implementing, that the synod be participated in by the worldwide community of the church. So all 1 billion Catholics are in the process of discernment and dialogue. It was not simply a 1 week or a 2 week project to fill out a questionnaire. Synodality is whenever we gather together. So consciously and deliberately, clusters of people such as yourselves should come together in prayer, asking this question: how is the Spirit moving in our lives? And the more we share that with one another, it influences how we think economically, politically, geographically. Our mind and hearts expand under the inspiration of the Spirit. The church is not only a teaching authority, it's also a discerning reality. And oftentimes, what scholars teach is what people have discovered in the depth of their heart. As disciples of Jesus, we have no right to withhold our light and our insight from one another. We also have an obligation to share the depth of our experience with one another. How is the Spirit moving within us? And so for the rest of my life, I begin every session, especially in the Catholic community, with the ancient prayer of the church for the synod. And this is found in the synod handbook. It goes back to about the 3rd or the 4th century, somewhat amended over the years. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather together in your name. With you alone to be our shepherd, make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. We are always in need of forgiveness and healing. Do not let us promote disorder. Do not let ignorance lead us down the wrong path, nor partiality influence our actions. Let us find in you our unity, that we may journey together to the fullness of life and not stray from what is right, true, good, and beautiful. All this we ask of you who are at work in every place, in every one, all the time, in communion with the Father and the Son, forever and ever. Amen. Today, with a short break, I would like to reflect with you on the first 2 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew. Again, with all apology to Matthew's Gospel, I have selected various verses to consider. In no way do I imply that the verses that I am emphasizing point out that the other verses are lesser value. Rather, from another perspective, we could go back to those verses. let's do a little bit of preliminary work and review how we might interpret before we actually look at text. First, the question can be asked, how many Gospels are there? And the answer is always one: the Gospel of Jesus Christ. However, if you read Paul's letter to the Romans, Paul called it the Gospel of God that was revealed in Jesus Christ. We as Christian people have made Jesus the center of our concern. But to make Jesus the center of our concern is to make the concern of Jesus the center of our lives. If you look at Jesus, Jesus put God at the center of his life. And not any old God, but the God of the Hebrew Bible. And what you probably noticed in the readings, the first readings since Ash Wednesday, that you have extraordinary readings from the Hebrew Bible, and that part of the Hebrew Bible called the prophets. And of the prophets, the one that's perhaps heard the most is Isaiah. And these prophets complained and argued against the king, the priest, and the temple. If the king, the priest, and the temple were not centered with extraordinary love and justice for the poor, the broken, the marginalized, and the rejected. So there is no way in the Hebrew Bible to worship the God of heaven and ignore the oppressed on earth. What gave legitimacy to the king, relevance to the temple, and authenticity to the priest is whether or not the nation and those institutions acted with justice toward the poor. This is the great meaning behind the Exodus. When God liberates the Israelites from the powers of Egypt, from the powers of oppression, that becomes the paradigm or the common denominator for the whole Bible. The issues of justice are not secondary to the God of Israel. The issues of justice are the key as to whether or not the worship of God is authentic. No sacrifice offered to God makes any sense if there's not justice in the land toward the poor, the broken, the marginalized, the hated, and the failed. So when we talk about the gospel of Jesus, we're talking about the gospel of God, and not any old God, but the God of the Hebrew Bible, the worship of which is directly related to the relationship you have with the poor, the broken, and the stranger. In some aspects of modern Christianity, people have thought that relationship to the poor was a matter of charity as opposed to a matter of justice. So our communities are meant to be communities where we raise the consciousness of what is happening within the world. And this must not be reduced to simply the arguments of partisan politics. The disciple of Jesus crosses over the borders the world would impose in order to see that everyone is a child of God. So the one gospel of Jesus is based on the one God of justice. Now, justice in a country such as ours generally means to punish the wicked and reward the good. But we're talking about justice in the Bible. And in the Bible, the word justice is synonymous with the word mercy and respect. So justice makes right that which is wrong. Justice raises up the lowly. Justice is motivated by charity and love and respect. The second thing to keep in mind is that the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are four different and distinct, but interrelated and interconnected proclamations of the one gospel of God in Christ Jesus.
We on the screen.
The individual authors and the individual churches and traditions behind the four gospels influenced what the gospel writer might have proclaimed. It is doubtful as to whether or not the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John thought that they were writing documents that you would read today. If they knew that, if they knew that these four gospels would become normative to the New Testament and standard in the churches of Jesus, they may have composed them differently. So they composed them in light of the world in which they lived, with the immediate problems they were concerned with the immediate communities they were interacting with. Therefore, when we interpret, we sometimes have to realize that to understand the authentic interpretation of a particular verse, narrative, story, or proclamation will require some understanding of the circumstance in which it was written. And that's true today. You may find in your treasure box that your grandmother sent you a letter when you were 7 years old. If we were to look at that letter when you were 7 years old and analyze it, we would have some understanding of what life was like when you were 7 years old, what life was like in general. But she wasn't writing to you about generalities. She was writing to you as a person. So we would discover certain things about you as a person. These four gospels have influenced the church for almost 2,000 years. Remember, it took 400 years for the church to decide what books of the New Testament constitute the New Testament. So long before we had a New Testament, we had a dynamic tradition that first of all gave us the scripture. The last thing we want to keep in mind is what is the perspective of the individual gospels. Mark, who is the first gospel, is the source of Matthew and Luke. Mark is a Jew writing to a Gentile community. Matthew, on the other hand, is Jewish, writing to a mixed community. It's a community of Jews and Gentiles, but this obviously was a community that had deep appreciation for the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew tradition. Because Matthew, more than any other gospel, continuously uses the techniques called fulfilling the prophet. So over and over again, Matthew, more than any other gospel, but not exclusively, quotes the Hebrew Bible by saying, "Thus says the prophet," or "this was done to fulfill what the prophet said." Luke is a Gentile, probably writing to the Gentile community, especially Gentiles who may have been in the process of converting to Judaism. And John's gospel shows a remarkable understanding of the Hebrew Bible, but seems to be a gospel that proclaims to a community that has moved beyond the ancient church itself as such. So each one of these gospels has a perspective in it that's good for us to keep in mind. Matthew, then, we will look for how Matthew constantly goes back to the Hebrew Bible. And sometimes one incident is going to come up today where Matthew quotes the Hebrew Bible or says he does, and there's no such quotation in the Hebrew Bible. He gets so carried away with fulfilling it that he doesn't even double check to see if the verse exists, or is he being highly creative? It's what we'll end on today, and it's an ingenious thing that Matthew does. Now, the first two chapters of Matthew's gospel concern the birth of Jesus. The last two chapters of Matthew's gospel, chapter 27 and 28, deal with the resurrection, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the sending forth of Jesus. Actually, 26, 27, and 28. Matthew's main body divides into 5 parts, and we'll look at those 5 parts next week when we get to the discourses. 5 times in Matthew's gospel, Jesus teaches profoundly. We call them the 5 Matthean discourses, or the 5 teachings of Jesus. The birth of Jesus in Matthew's gospel is obviously related to the birth of Jesus in Luke's gospel. The first 2 chapters of Luke and the first 2 chapters of Matthew constitute the material that we use to develop the Christmas season. But of the 2, the one we like the most is Luke. So if you're into eggnog, Christmas trees, and all is bright and all is calm, and grandmother's coming to town and she's going to bring us gifts and she has her secret recipe for fruitcake, you'll love the Gospel of Luke. Because in the Gospel of Luke, saw all of the images, the primary images that we like about Christmas are seen. The little town of Bethlehem, the shepherds coming to the manger. The manger itself are all Lucan. Matthew tells a different story. Matthew's story is brutal, so brutal that the essence of Matthew's account is never told on Christmas Day. It's told on December 28th, the Feast of Holy Innocents. What we like about Matthew's gospel is made it all the way to Christmas cards. And you know that whenever a Bible verse inspires a Christmas card, it has received the affirmation of secular society, is the star. So the star that goes to Bethlehem, which is not in Luke, it's in Matthew. Now, at this point, you may be asking yourself, I thought Matthew and Luke would tell the same thing. In Matthew's gospel, the child is born in the house of Joseph in Bethlehem at home. In Luke's gospel, the child is born in exile in Bethlehem in a manger. Only Luke has a manger. So the differences in the 2 narratives lead people to ask the question, which one's true? Now, St. Francis didn't like to answer the question, which one's true, so he put the 2 of them together, favoring Luke, and invented the nativity scene. So you have a nativity scene with shepherds and magi. Well, if Matthew and Luke got a hold of that, they would say, wait a minute. Matthew would say, why do you have shepherds and mangers in my infancy account? The child was born in the house of Joseph. Luke would say, why do you have magi and stars in my shepherd angel story? The child was born in the manger. Which one's true? Here's a better question. What is the truth in each one? So even though you have differences in the detail, and you can buy 300 or 400 books who all take position as to which one should have priority or how we might put them together, I would leave them distinct because that's how they were written, and ask the question, what is the truth? What did Matthew mean by what Matthew wrote? what did Luke mean by what Luke wrote? So did you ever go to a cocktail party and arrive late and find out that there were 5 people talking about you because you said something last week? So you show up and suddenly there's silence and you say, what are you talking about? Well, George, to tell the truth, we were talking about you. Last week you said, Betty and Mary think you meant, and Bill and David think you meant this. Now that George is there, he can tell you what he meant. Remember, before you try to guess what other people might be thinking, it might be good to ask them. We can't do that in this case. We don't have Matthew and Luke as persons. We have their writings. So the least we could do is respect their differences and seek the truth they might have intended. Here's how we might do that. Does it make us better people? Does it invite us to be deeper, authentic disciples of Jesus? Is it consistent with the rest of the gospel? So we're not at the mercy of the wind. We can derive the insight from the gospel itself. Let's look at some scenes in Matthew chapter 1 and 2 from that perspective, forgetting that we know anything about Luke. But a moment. Luke will keep coming back in because this is the Christmas story after all, and we love the Christmas story. First of all, a perspective. The Christmas story is not called a Christmas story in Matthew and Luke. If you went up to Matthew and Luke and said, that was a lovely Christmas story, they would go, what? What is Christmas? Never heard of it. Christmas was invented in the 4th century and obviously used Matthew and Luke. So long before we celebrated the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, we celebrated another birth of Jesus from the Epistle to the Romans. This is what Paul said. That Jesus is the firstborn of the dead. So in the ancient church, to say Jesus was born was the same thing as to say Jesus is risen. The earth gave him birth. That's why in the Easter season, we all run around with eggs and chicks and ducks and new life and baby this and baby that. It's new life, the firstborn of the dead. So long before there was any idea of Jesus being born in history, there was this shocking, alarming, transforming idea. He is the firstborn of the dead. As a matter of fact, Matthew and Luke, from every indication we can discover, very well composed the birth narratives last. So they wrote about the birth of Jesus from the viewpoint of the cross and the resurrection. So everything about the cross and the resurrection is embedded in the birth of Jesus in Matthew and Luke. Now, if you ever had a child or a baby, here's what many parents do, or grandparents do, or family members do. As the child grows up and becomes a person with particular characteristics of interest and perspectives, grandma might say this, oh, David graduated from medical school. Isn't David a sweetheart? Grandma might say, I knew from the day he was born, he was going to be a physician. Really, Grandma, how did you know that? Because when he was born, he smiled at the doctor on call. So she now tells the birth from the viewpoint of the life. The life is read back into the birth and the growing up. And that's exactly what you have in ancient nativity stories. When ancient people wrote birth stories, they oftentimes read the life of the person back into the details of the birth. Does that make sense to everybody? So interestingly enough, there are details of the resurrection and the crucifixion embedded in the birth story. So that the birth story is not the introduction to the gospel, it's the proclamation of the gospel. So at one and the same time, it serves as introduction and proclamation. That's why it's extremely possible to read the birth of Jesus out of season. But many of us may have grown up with thinking you can only read the birth of Jesus in December. So if you stand up on the 15th of July and start reading about the birth of Jesus, somebody may say it's out of season. No, it's not. Because it's not introduction to gospel, it is the gospel. Let's go now, if you have the notes, to page 1. Now here's how the notes are laid out. First, you have a couple of pages labeled the text. In this case, page 1 and 2 is the text. These are the scripture verses that we're dealing with today. Pages 3 to the end are the text and the commentary. So I gave you a commentary and text after I gave you the text itself. I do that so that my commentary doesn't distract from your reading of the text. I also do not use notes in the sessions. All I use is the text. The notes are meant to be supplemental to what I say, or I'll be supplementing the notes. So you will have some summation of what I'm sharing with you, as well as the text themselves. Chapter 1, verse 18. Now the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place this way. Well, that's fascinating. Matthew tells you straight out, Matthew considers this Jesus to be the Messiah. Now, back in the time when Jesus was born, the word Messiah had many, many different definitions. There's no one consistent understanding of Messiah in Judaism. There wasn't then, and there isn't now. So in Matthew's gospel, what Matthew means by Jesus being Messiah will unfold through the whole gospel. And Matthew's interpretation of Jesus as Messiah will be shocking, because the word Messiah is usually interchangeable for someone who has power, authority, influence, and wins, who restores the land, restores the people, restores the peace, throws off oppression. So when you say Jesus is Messiah, you mean something particular to the Gospels, and that's what will unfold. Messiah, by the way, is the Hebrew word for the Greek word Christ. Christ is not a name in Greek. It means anointed, or in a Gentile community, one who's smeared with oil. So if you're one of those people like I am, that after you take your morning shower, you have to splatter yourself and slather yourself with moisturizers, then you know what it's like to be Messiah, because it literally means one who's rubbed down with oil. It obviously means much more than that in the Bible, because to be anointed with oil means to be possessed with the Spirit. To possess with the Spirit means to manifest the light of God in the sometimes darkness of the world. So Jesus is the Messiah in verse 18. Wow, then we're going to hear about a mighty warrior, a great priest, a powerful man. Stay tuned for the story. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph. Thank you, Matthew. Mary who and Joseph who? Who are these people? They just show up in the scene. They mean something to you. They mean something to me because we've been speaking about them for 2,000 years. But in the initial gospel, Mary and Joseph, imagine if you walked into a shopping center and there were 1,000 people there and you said, attention, please, attention, please. I would like to tell you about Mary and about Bill and Elizabeth. Excuse me, Bill and Elizabeth who? Mary and Joseph who? Those names are extraordinary to us today. They're also extraordinary in the New Testament. And this is what we know. When Jesus was a boy, the name Joseph, Jesus, and Mary were kind of common. Mary is the derivative of Miriam, the sister of Moses, who interpreted the Exodus. Joseph is the patriarch of the Hebrew Bible in the book of Genesis, who had dreams of liberation and freedom. Jesus is the name of the 6th book of the Bible, Joshua, the liberator. Oh. And this Mary and Joseph were engaged. But before they lived together, she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit, whatever that might mean. Now remember, engagement had the force of marriage. So Joseph, her husband, a righteous man, righteous doesn't mean self-righteous. Righteous means like unto God. Unwilling to expose her publicly, planned to dismiss or divorce her quietly. Joseph had every right to drag her out into the street and say, she's been unfaithful to me. She's a fornicator. What we see in Mary and Joseph, especially in Joseph, Luke emphasizes Mary, but Matthew emphasizes Joseph, is that they're not simply presented as mother and father. They're presented as disciples. So long before the child is born, they are already the disciples of Jesus. And we see in Joseph the just man, Joseph the righteous man, exactly what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. And hold on, because Joseph never says anything. And sometimes, we can talk all day long and say nothing. And then there's always people in our lives who say nothing, but speak volumes in their deeds. The attitude of their heart, the deeds of their hand transform everyone around them. Verse 20. But just when he resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Oh, there's the Joseph. There's the Joseph of the Hebrew Bible, the interpreter of dreams, and the Joseph of the New Testament, the one who dreams. All through these first 2 chapters, an angel of the Lord will appear to Joseph in a dream. In ancient times, the dream was the vehicle of revelation. The great priest might say, let me sleep on that. Oh, we even say that today. Let me sleep on that. As a matter of fact, in the dream technique and spiritual practice, I might ask myself a question, a bewildering question, a perplexing question before I go to bed. and dream the answer, dream the perspective. The Hebrew Bible says that God gives to his beloved in dreams. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife. She has conceived the child by the power of the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son. You will name him Jesus, because he will save the people from their sins. Another way that could be translated, I think makes more sense. He will save the people from affliction. Matthew then says in verse 22, here's typical Matthew, all this took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. They shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. That makes no sense. Think about how nonsensical this is. The angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and says, you shall call the child Jesus. And Matthew said that's to fulfill the text, he'll be called Emmanuel. Well, how does calling somebody Jesus fulfill the text as Emmanuel? My grandmother always wanted me to call my son Harry, so I called him David in fulfillment of her wishes. What? So that Jesus, before he's even born, has two names, Jesus Emmanuel. And you will see the Jesus Emmanuel names run through the whole gospel, all the way to the last verse. In the last verse of Matthew's gospel, the Emmanuel insight will crescendo. So that Jesus is liberated. Here's what the word Emmanuel means. God is with you. Well, I reconsider that. Not only is God with you, but God is for you. Somebody can be with you and against you. Court of law, lawsuit, fist fight in an elevator. Present to you, in love with you, the Emmanuel, glued to you. Paul put it this way, crucified to you, bonded with you, in solidarity with you, within you. When Jesus awoke, I guess we're allowed to use that word, from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took Mary as his wife, had no relations with her until the son was born, and he named him Jesus. Gotta love Joseph. Says nothing. Thinks about it, ponders it. Remember, in Luke's gospel, Mary pondered in her heart. In Matthew's gospel, Joseph ponders in his dreams. So Joseph is at home. He takes Mary into his house. Pope Francis, when he came to Washington, D.C., and had lunch with the poor and the houseless, he was invited to have lunch with the powerful and the influential, but he went and had lunch with the poor and the broken and the houseless. And he gave a very, very beautiful reflection at the luncheon. He said, Joseph wondered, why does Mary have no home? I wonder why you have no home. Joseph took Mary into his home. We need to take one another into our homes. Oh my. Here you see Joseph fulfilling Matthew 25. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was hungry and you fed me. Naked and you clothed me. Joseph is the exemplar of what it is to be a disciple. Any thoughts, any feelings? I talked too much. We're already 45 minutes into this. So
It's all
any
good.
questions?
It's all good. Wow.
So Matthew is implying Joseph has a house. Joseph has a job. Joseph has employment. Joseph has stability. And Joseph places all of that in great vulnerability. You know how it is that sometimes if you do something great, it can become controversial to the neighbors, to the community, and you put yourself in jeopardy. Here you see Joseph putting himself in jeopardy, and we'll see how that works out. Darcy, do we need to take a little break?
Sure. Let's just take a few minutes, maybe a 3 or 4 minute break, just to stretch and then come right back.
I have a question, and you can bring this up if it feels meaningful when we come
Hi,
back.
Renee, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Okay.
Was there an expectation in thinking about in the Hebrew Bible that Messiah meant a single person that would come, or was it more of a broader understanding?
Yes, both. It's
Okay.
fluid. It's fluid. It can refer to, matter of fact, many think that it refers to the people. It doesn't even have to refer to a Jewish person. As a matter of fact, the first Messiah named in the Hebrew Bible refers to a foreign king, Cyrus.
Mm.
Isaiah 45 talks about King Cyrus as the Messiah. So it's a fluid term. In Christianity, it becomes narrow.
Mm.
The term is refashioned so it fits Jesus. But in Judaism, it can refer to, across to, collectively, individually, and it's a term that can come and go.
Mm.
Does that help?
Yeah. So is Matthew kind of transforming it into a single identity in Jesus, or does that come later?
Oh, I think it comes later. I think Matthew accesses the term, but I don't know if Matthew would have limited the meaning of the term.
Okay. Well, yeah, thanks.
And here's why I say that, because the followers of Jesus will eventually be called Christian. Well, the word Christian means one who's anointed.
Mhm.
So are messiahs.
Mm.
Mm.
We're all little messiahs running around. And we're called to anoint other people.
Mhm.
Mm.
So it's meant to be like a contagious, something that's contagious but wonderful. It's the anointed that won't stop anointing.
Yeah, and that's just very different and much more wonderful than, the understanding I grew up with, which was this sense of like a proof text that Jesus was the one they were waiting for.
Mhm.
Yes, that's a crucial question. Matthew does not use the Hebrew Bible for proof texting. Proof texting is actually 16th, 17th century Protestant Europe, as opposed to here.
Mm.
Here it's not proof texting, it's underscoring Jesus as faithful.
Mm.
So for Jesus to fulfill the prophet is not for Jesus to eliminate the prophet.
Mm.
but to be in allegiance to the prophet.
Mm.
There's no sense of replacement.
Mm.
I liked how you pointed out or expanded the notion of anointed, meaning, I believe you said possessed by the Spirit. And so that's a great concept or phrase to remember, because we talk about anointings at baptism and confirmation and all of that, and that just has a fuller meaning. I always think of strength. That's the meaning that I tend to pull from that, but I like the idea of possessed by the Spirit, which is much more expansive and
Yes, and
not
that's
just
the
individualized anointing.
that's the great teaching in Vatican II, that the Spirit runs around the world.
Mhm.
The Spirit is not only in the church, but the Spirit's in the world. And of course, the Spirit anoints.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's interesting to me how sometimes we think that to be anointed in the Spirit is something we do.
Or is just for an individual's
Yeah.
benefit. Yeah.
The Hebrew Bible uses especially the prophet Joel. I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh.
Mhm.
It's like God skiing across the heavens and just pouring out.
Wow.
Isaiah uses the imagery of rain. May the rain pour down from heaven as great blessing. Are we ready to begin?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Matthew is a master storyteller, and the story takes on two twists. Immediately, Matthew expands the story, what we would call globally. The story of the birth of Jesus now takes on global significance because the passion, death, and resurrection had global significance. At the same time, the birth takes on a tragic dimension. The tragedy that unfolds in the birth of Jesus, according to Matthew, is so heartbreaking and graphically hideous that no Christmas liturgy preserves the story. Rather, the story is broken up into two different feasts. The Feast of Holy Innocents on December the 6th, and the Feast of Epiphany, usually on January the 6th, the 12th night. That's why it's important for us, since the Second Vatican Council, to understand that when we have a liturgical book on one side with the readings, we also need to have the scripture, so that we constantly read the liturgical readings in light of the biblical readings. Because the liturgy can rearrange the Bible for the sake of worship, perfectly legitimate. But we must never forget the integrity of the biblical text. Chapter 2, at the bottom of page 1. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, some wise men or astrologers or magi from the east came to Jerusalem. Now that's intriguing. From the time I was a little boy, the thing that really sent me over the edge with Christmas was the Magi. My grandmother had the three kings. You'll notice that nowhere in Matthew does he say three. There's three gifts, so we assume there's three Magi. But 12 Magi can bring three gifts. But my grandmother always had the Magi hidden somewhere on December 25th. And from December 25th to January the 6th, she would move them every day. So every day, the kids would all run to her house to see where she hid the Magi. And they would get close to the manger. See, there's the conflating of Luke and Matthew. And when you found them, you got a piece of candy. Not any old candy, but the Christmas candy. Wow. They were always mysterious. And they study stars. Many of us do that to this day. When we get up in the morning, we look at our horoscope to see whether or not we should go back to bed. They studied the stars because they believed that whenever anybody of any significance was born, they had a star. A star would appear. Notice that the star goes to the wrong city. It goes to Jerusalem because kings would be born in Jerusalem, Paris, London, Alexandria, New York, Los Angeles. That this star obviously goes to the place of power and notoriety. So they go to Jerusalem and they find King Herod. And they ask King Herod, where is the newborn king of the Judeans? Some translations say the Jews, but Judean would be a better translation. Now, my dear friends, one of the things you don't do, especially if you're wise, is you don't go to the old king and ask where the new one is. You don't go up to the mayor of the town and say, where's the newborn mayor of the town? It's a threat to political power and authority. And the Magi say something to Herod that's interesting. For we observed his star at its rising. And interestingly enough, the Greek word here, at its rising, is the word for the resurrection from the dead. And here's where you see the Epiphany antiphon. Oh, star, the star at its rising, becomes the Easter song. Because in the Easter song of the Easter Vigil prayer, the Exultet says, make Christ that morning star. So the star of paganism becomes the star of Hebrew light, becomes the presence of Christ rising. We saw his star at his rising. Many translations say we saw the star in the east. The reason why they translate east is because the Greek word for east is orient, or rising is oriente. Oriente means to rise, and it's rising. As a matter of fact, you can translate it in such a way that his star still rises. Here's where Christmas and Easter dance. We've come to pay him homage. There's the Good Friday antiphon. The Christmas antiphon is, oh, come, let us adore him. Good Friday, we say, behold the wood of the cross on which is hung the salvation of the world. Oh, come, let us adore. When King Herod heard about this, he was frightened. The Greek is much more powerful. The Greek says he experienced an earthquake in his gut. An earthquake is Matthew's mechanism for the resurrection of Jesus when Jesus dies. There's earthquakes. all of Jerusalem was disturbed as well because the political order is being threatened. There's outside people from Iran who are speaking about a newborn king in Judea. Herod, as we know, is a madman. Herod calls together the chief priests, the scribes, and the teachers of the law and inquires of them where the Messiah might be born. They say in Bethlehem of Judea, in fulfillment of the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. Forth from you shall come a people, forth from you shall come a ruler, who is to shepherd my people Israel. There's the shepherd theme. There's the sheep and the shepherd theme that runs through all four gospels, but crescendos in John. I am the good shepherd. Notice that the Magi now know where the child is, not because of the star, but because of the scripture. So Matthew's rendition, the Gentiles were led to the scripture by the star that leads them to Jesus. Then Herod secretly called the wise ones together and found from them the exact time the star appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem with these instructions. Go and search diligently for the child. See, there's the wisdom of the spiritual life. You and I are always diligently seeking the child. Right now, people in Ukraine, after Putin's killing and bombing, are looking for their children. The Pope goes to the Congo because in the Congo is where lithium comes from for our computers and cell phones. Lithium in the Congo is mined by 5-year-olds who are small enough to climb through tunnels. And oftentimes those tunnels collapse and crush the children to death. Make a search for the child diligently. Sex trafficking in well-to-do places in the United States. My daughter disappeared 15 years ago. I haven't seen my son since he was 4. When you have found him, come and tell me where he is, and I will come and offer him homage. Here we see a notorious king who killed his own children to hold on to his power, speaking with piety. You ever notice how corruption oftentimes wraps itself in piety? When they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star, the one they had seen at its rising. Notice how the wicked king says wise things, because truth doesn't care where it's born. The star stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star had stopped, notice this now, this is very beautiful. The Magi were overwhelmed with joy. And there's the sequence or the consequence of Easter, Pentecost. To be filled with joy is the same thing as to be filled with spirit. But overwhelmed, my cup overflows. My heart can't drink in much more. On entering the house, They saw the child with his mother Mary. They knelt down and paid him homage. Notice how Joseph is eclipsed. Joseph is like John the Baptizer in the Gospel of John. I must decrease, he must increase. While Joseph comes to the aid of the child and his mother, Joseph does not intrude. They offered from their treasure chests gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They must be pretty rich. St. Augustine interpreted this verse in a way that influenced the song, We Three Kings. We Three Kings is a Christmas, Easter, Good Friday song. Pull it out sometime this afternoon and listen to it. I bring frankincense. I bring myrrh. I bring gold. The one that brings myrrh sings, for he will be sealed in a cold, dark tomb. It's very inappropriate as Christmas gifts. Here's some embalming fluid. The Hebrew Bible speaks, there's a treasure in your heart worth more than gold, frankincense, and myrrh. While myrrh was used for the dead, it was also expensive and precious. So look at the song, We Three Kings. You don't know if it's Good Friday, Easter Sunday, or Christmas Eve. Verse 12. They were warned in a dream. Oh, Joseph is contagious. If you hang around Joseph long enough, you'll start dreaming, especially in the time of trouble. Not to return to Herod. They left for their country by another road. Christians from ancient times loved this verse, by another road. To meet Jesus is to change our lives. Up to this point, we carried treasure for ourselves. Having met him, we divest ourselves of treasure. Go and sell everything you have and follow me. They follow him this time by not following the star, but the light that's in their heart. Divested of their treasures. They now have the treasure that no money can buy, no status can conquer, no power can eliminate. Notice how the Christmas story, which is the source of great piety and great inspiration, is also the story that gives us some key inroads to the depth of the spiritual life. If Joseph never said anything, the child, who's the center of all of this, is still somewhat a baby. And yet we can see our lives shifting and changing because we're making a diligent search for the child. And if we read this from the perspective of Luke, we would say, he's in the manger of your heart. But for Luke, he's in the house of your soul. In Matthew. Now remember, for Matthew, that word house is going to become very significant because in chapter 18, especially, the house will be the image of the church. The Pope Francis says whose doors must be wide open in case somebody comes looking for Christ. Here's the Magi come looking for Christ, strangers from afar. And the land is riddled with violence. They let perfect strangers into their house to see the child. What comes next is heartbreaking. After they left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up. Wait, see, I was all ready to settle down and marinate in the beauty of the moment. watching the Magi go back by another way, the star going back into the heavens and shining brightly, the radiation of light coming from the treasures that were left behind. Maybe tonight some poor people will have something to eat. We just want to sit here in the moment and bask in the friendship of the Spirit. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, get out of the country. You don't have time for papers. Sneak over the border, get out of here, get out of Judea, go out into the wilderness, crawl across the land of Moab, go down to where the ancestors came from. For I tell you, Herod is about to search for the child and destroy him. There's the passion. There's the passion of the child. So important was this to Catholic spirituality in particular that a wonderful woman by the name of Carol Houselander wrote a very powerful book, The Passion of the Infant Jesus. Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and fled to Egypt. This is why the church is madly in love with immigrants. This is why the church is madly in love with displaced people. This is why there's a pontifical council for people who journey. It includes truck drivers, cab drivers, streetcar conductors, and subways. Nomadic people. Vatican II called this people the pilgrim people. It's one of the images of the church. We're all pilgrim people. We're on a great journey. Take the child and his mother. Flee by night to Egypt. Go to a land that's not yours. Settle with a people that's not yours. The other night I saw a very powerful video of people in Romania greeting people from the Ukraine. Not too far back in history, Romanians and Ukrainians were enemies. But Romanians have a history of being displaced. When they heard the Ukrainians were displaced, they welcomed them. Learned from them. Not simply gave them tents and empty lots, but housing. Welcome to your country. Welcome to your home. We know what it's like. Notice how the child is suffering everything his people suffered. Displacement, killing, oppression, great loss. Remain there till Herod is dead. This was what's to fulfill what the prophet said, I call my child out of Egypt. Israel coming forth from Egypt is the great experience of all. The imagery is we're all being called by the Spirit out of the Egypts of our lives. When Herod saw that the wise men had tricked him, he was infuriated. He started to kill all of the children in and around Bethlehem, especially little boys that were 2 years of age and younger. What is it about powerful people that have to kill children? Put them in cages, separate them from their families, sell them into sex slavery, sell them into slavery. What is it? This was to fulfill the prophet Jeremiah. A voice is heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be consoled. They are no more. The story becomes dark and tragic. How would you sing, all is calm, all is bright? That's Luke. Maybe not. Certainly not Matthew. That's why in my Christmas tree, I always hang a crucifix. Otherwise, it becomes the glitter of the season rather than the beauty of his self-giving. What we see here, my dear friends, is that Jesus will say or do nothing till he lives the plight of his people. The whole history of Israel is being retold in the history of the child Jesus. He suffers what they suffer. He suffers what many of us continue to suffer. He suffers what I hope none of us would ever do to another person. Here's a Jesus who will say and do nothing till he knows what it is to be you. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared to Joseph in a dream. By this time, if I were Joseph, I'd be afraid to go to sleep. At least it's disturbing. Not again. Notice how Joseph thought that didn't even cross his mind, according to Matthew. Joseph is radically open to the movement of the angel. By the way, in the Hebrew Bible, the word angel is synonymous with God. It means a message from God. Get up, take the child and his mother and go back to the land of Israel. For those who were seeking the child are dead. Get up and go. Get up and go back. There was as much urgency to get out of the country as there is to get into the country. Hurry up and go back. As if we're waiting for him. Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, went back to the land of Israel. God love it. Good old Joseph. Is he jumping through hoops? I think not. How do I know that? Because he's paying attention to his dreams. Many of us are afraid to dream. Pope Francis for the Synod said, he said, what is your dream for the church of the third millennium? Not what's your opinion, not what you want. But what's your dream? What's your dream for the future of the church? It goes beneath what I want. It even goes beneath what I see. It goes to what I discern in my heart of heart, in my dreams. Notice how Joseph is becoming like the angel. He's had so many visions from angels that Joseph could be the one, or Joseph could be the angel who appears. When Joseph heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he went to the district of Galilee. Notice Jesus was born in Judea, according to Matthew. Galilee is his adopted place because Joseph gets displaced. Remember, if Joseph moves from Judea to Galilee, Joseph can't sell the house. Then they'll know where he is. Joseph loses the house. Joseph loses his employment. Joseph loses everything for the sake of the child and his mother. This is the disciple. This is the image of what any mother or father would do for their kids. It's the image of what any spouse would do for their beloved. It's the image of what Joseph would do for you. That's why Pope Francis ordered that Joseph's name be permanently fixed in the Eucharistic prayer with Mary. Protector of the church. He made his home in a town called Nazareth. Nobody in their right mind would go to Nazareth. Nazareth, a few years before the birth of Jesus, was leveled by the Roman troops. It's a mud hole. But Joseph makes the decision. It's unlikely they'll come back again. They already did the damage. Matthew then said this was to fulfill the prophet. He shall be called a Nazarene. No such verse exists. What prophet? Closest we can get is Judges, which isn't a prophet, sort of. Uncertain. Let's examine this word Nazarene. It's corrupted in Greek. He shall be called the Nazarene can mean he came from Nazareth. But nobody wants to come from Nazareth. The only reason why we go to Nazareth is because Jesus came from there. The other thing it could mean, he shall be called the Nazir, Nazir. Nazir is one dedicated to God. The ancient Nazirs didn't cut any hair. Every inch of their hair was dedicated to God. So does it mean Nazarene? From a mud hole of treachery and failure and hurt? What does it mean dedicated to God? Oh, the two-named one, Jesus Emmanuel, now has these two perspectives. Here's the dedicated one who comes to the mud holes and hell holes of our lives. But we will see that Jesus will be like Joseph. He'll be the walking dream of God in our lives. For no one will he be a nightmare except those who refuse to lift up the lowly. But even there, he will be a point of invitation. Follow your heart rather than your greed. So here's a Joseph that says nothing, nor did Mary for that matter. And here's a Jesus who absolutely said and did nothing except be a baby or a 2-year-old and younger. And yet the whole gospel unfolded up out of Egypt, down into Egypt, up out of Egypt. So that's why if we was to conflate Matthew with Luke, not only would we lose Luke, we'd lose Matthew. He shall be called the Nazarene, the dedicated one who is with us in the worst moments of our life. Thank you, Jesus, the liberator, our Emmanuel, who's always with us. Any thoughts, any feelings, anything you'd like to share?
Was it Matthew's gospel where the question is, can anything, the kind of the joke almost, can anything good come from Nazareth? Was it?
It's in John's gospel.
It's John's. Okay.
Yes, but you can see it's in that same tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Can anything good come from Nazareth? That's right.
Well,
it's not
especially
just
if it means corruption. I mean, if that's the understanding that it's, and yes, good can come from that. Yeah.
Nazareth would be the equivalent of a bombed out city that's slowly being rebuilt.
Mhm.
So you can see why the Magi would be baffled. Why would he come from a place like that? He's a king, so he has to have a throne and power and might and authority. He's the Messiah. The Messiah is strong and mighty. The Messiah is the baby. Maybe Joseph's the Messiah. Maybe you're the Messiah. Oh, so that it's getting fluid. It's beginning to get abundant.
Great.
That's why sometimes if we go to the worst moments in our lives is where we'll find our greatest insights and our deepest courage. This is an introduction to the gospel. It is gospel.
Love all the parallels to resurrection or the passion. It's amazing. Very good.
You have word, imagery, and the feeling, how it feels. You can see, especially in the Magi episode, it's stately beauty, it's tenderness, it's insight, and it's in your faith meanness, killing the children. Now you can see in Matthew's gospel when Jesus says, "Let the children come to me and do not hinder them. It is to just such as these that the kingdom of God belongs." He took a child in his arms and embraced him. The birth of Jesus in the first two chapters become the window through which we see the splendor of the whole gospel. It would be very, very good to have Joseph standing very close to your heart. His radiant presence will illuminate what it is you see, hear, and feel.
Any other questions for Father Tom as you ponder all this? Feel free to unmute.
So, like, what would the time frame have been like between like when they went to Egypt and then came back? Like, about how much of a time span? How old would he have been?
No more than 2.
So he still was about 2 years old between that time.
No more than 2, if this is historical. So this is the question. Trying to establish the history here would be very, very difficult because we don't have the date of the birth. Oddly enough, the calculated birth of Jesus is 4 BC. So 4 years before Jesus was born, Jesus was born.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that would make the date, using our system, no later than 2 CE.
So then they weren't in Egypt for very long.
See, the length of time and the historical accuracy is not the concern. The concern is that Jesus' life, ministry, and work is born up out of, he parallels the experience of the life of his people. Outside of Herod, Joseph, and Mary, notice how no characters take on any real persona. They remain more forces at work than individual decision makers. Even the Magi are not given names. The tradition gives them names, but Matthew does not. He called them some. So these are Matthew's rendition, inspires us to tell story on story, which is very, very legitimate. But I always caution you, don't confuse the story you tell with the story Matthew tells. Tell the story in light of Matthew, that's perfectly legitimate. But don't replace Matthew's story. Let it always be the home base to which you go. So those are, we're always going to ask the questions concerning history as we understand it, because that's how we get to appreciate it. And so those questions are not invalid, nor are they superfluous. They're rather essential to our probing of the word. Because if we historicize these stories, then we can concretize the movement of the Spirit in our own world. Notice on one side, Herod is killing people, and on the other side, the Magi are rejoicing. Not over the killing of the people, but they don't allow the hardships of life. And they don't no longer allow the success of life to interfere with the treasure of the heart, who is Jesus. So in the gospel, you'll see stories of people who are remarkably failed. Matthew's one of them. And people who are remarkably successful. And the trick is not to let the heartbreak or the success interfere with the discipleship. Also, those in response to your question, the
Thanks.
journey is what's necessary, that they went down, came back. But there's the pilgrim nature. And that was one of the titles Vatican II restored to the church. We are a pilgrim people. We're always seeking and diligently looking for the child around us and within us.
Thank you. I always think of, when I think of the historical, the need for people to have those historical facts, which is so part of our nature sometimes. I always loved Megan McKenna's quote, "Everything in the Bible is true, and some of it actually happened." Because it spoke to me of that deeper truth, that
Well, the other thing is it's
That's
actually
relatable.
happening.
and happening.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I like that. Mhm,
What's happening in Matthew's gospel continues to happen. That's why
mhm.
some of us may find it difficult to be people of faith, because we get overwhelmed with the darkness of the world.
Mhm.
We get overwhelmed with the inconsistency, and we get overwhelmed with the inconsistency of ourselves. So these are no pie in the sky gospel. They don't have a Jesus movement to solve a bed of roses.
Very good.
So next week, we'll see what this Emmanuel Jesus, who comes from Nazareth, who's dedicated from God, does. Now that he's
Stay
been
tuned.
around the block a couple of times, what will he say and what will he do? What will be his constitution of his heart? What will he proclaim? What's the first great teaching Jesus will proclaim? You know it backwards. So we'll look at it in some details. We'll highlight some verses to reset the gears for our own spiritual journey. Really good to see you, everyone. God bless.
Good to
Be
see you.
well.
Thank you
Love
so
you.
much. Thank you once again, and I look forward to seeing you
Mhm.
all next week. And for those of you that are watching the recording, if you have any questions, feel free to send them to me, and I can include them and bring them to the next session.
That'd be great. And that goes for anybody here too. If you have any questions you want to write out or send, we can pick them up next week. Okay.
Good.
God
Thank
bless.
you,
Love you.
everybody. God
Thank you.
bless.
Thank you.